Hello and welcome to the Progress Theory, where we discuss scientific principles for optimizing human performance. My name is Dr. Phil Price, and on today's episode we are joined by S&C and Physiology lecturer from St Mary's University, Dr. Matt Buckthorpe, to discuss the physiological adaptations to muscle from strength and power training. To truly understand what type of training we need to do to achieve our goals, we really need to understand what happens at the neuromuscular level. How does our body adapt to the stress of different types of resistance training? And this is why I brought Matt onto the Progress Theory. In this episode, we discuss differences in muscle fibre composition, the differences in adaptation caused by strength and or power training, and do we have an adaptive genetic strength ceiling? As always, follow the Progress Theory on Instagram, YouTube, head to our website, theprogresstheory.com, and check out all of our other episodes. Here is Dr. Matt Buckthorpe. Hey Matt, how are you doing?
Hi Phil, very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming on. I've been looking forward to this episode in particular because we've been speaking to a lot of practitioners around, what their programs are like, what kind of strategies do they use to try and improve strength and power, but we haven't really had anything yet which delves into the neuromuscular properties of someone that might be really strong. What adaptations actually happen when you do strength and power training, and I think that's really essential to actually know. If you're doing a program and you're programming specific things, you want to know what happens to the human body in response to that. Otherwise, you're just programming randomly. So it's really great to have you on.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, very, very keen to talk about this. Got a real passion for this area. It's where I probably focus a little bit of my stuff more so. So yeah, very looking forward to today.
Nice. Do you want to give a bit of a background into yourself?
Of course, yes. So obviously, Matt Buckthorpe. I'm unsure what I am in terms of probably started out as a sports scientist, sport and exercise scientist, so kind of undergrad, masters, sport and exercise science, and then stayed on, did a PhD over at Loughborough. So that was in neuromuscular performance, so kind of neuromuscular physiology, a little bit of biomechanics. And then from there, kind of ventured into elite football for a couple of years with a view of hopefully going into maybe coaching, and then got very passionate about kind of late stage rehab, return to play. So after a stint in football, joined a company called Isokinetic Medical Group. So they kind of specialize in kind of injury management, so the general public and also elite level athletes. And so it's kind of a rehab specialist with them for sort of 4 or 5 years, and then kind of took a spin towards focusing more around education and research, and particularly within rehab. So recently been putting out a lot of stuff around rehab processes, designing rehab programs, kind of with a focus of incorporating some of the strength and conditioning theory and science into aiding treating athletes, basically. And then joined St Mary's a couple of years ago, firstly as a lecturer in sports rehab, and now more recently in strength and conditioning and physiology.
Well, hey. Now, co-workers, don't worry about the rehab side. Join the S&C lot.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening to that, Matt has done some great stuff regarding return to play, and I've read a few of his papers. You've got a ResearchGate. Am I right? I'm sure. I think I went through Google Scholar to find this stuff. But
yeah. Got a ResearchGate. Yeah.
So I'll definitely put all those links in the show notes for anyone that's interested in those areas. But we've actually got quite a number of topics there which we could discuss. We'll have to bring you on again, especially some of the rehab stuff. But just to start off with this particular topic, let's start off really basic. Say that I'm new to strength training. I do an 8-week block, basic strength training. What kind of neuromuscular adaptations are likely to occur?
Cool. So obviously been new to strength training, of course you're gonna see a mix of adaptations. So normally what we first see when we first start strength training is not so much changes within the muscle, but it's kind of more changes within the nervous system. And so it's kind of like learning how to lift. And it will depend, of course, on your type of training. So if you're doing something that's a little bit more functional, or if you're doing maybe a little bit more isolated kind of strength training. But what we'll generally see is a mix of neural and morphological adaptations. So within the first few weeks, it's mostly going to be neural. So that's things like improvements in coordination. So for that, we have like two terms. One's intermuscular coordination. So that's like coordination between the different muscle groups. So that we normally think about like the agonist muscles, which is like the main movers. So if you're doing a biceps curl, it'll be your biceps. Your antagonist will be like your triceps. And then your stabilizers and your synergists are obviously important for like guiding and supporting the stability of a joint. So what we see early on is improvements in how we coordinate those muscles. And then what we also tend to see is an improvement in how much of the muscle we can kind of access and activate. So let's say at the start of training, we might only be recruiting maybe 90% of our muscle fibers, for example. And then maybe after the first 3 or 4 weeks, we can access more of those muscle fibers. Obviously, I can delve deeper into that. But so there's kind of like neural adaptations. Then within the muscle, what we'll start to see is over time, we'll start to see more and more muscle hypertrophy. So within that, the muscle size will get bigger, and obviously the more muscle we have, generally the more force we can produce. And then we will tend to see some other types of adaptations associated with the muscle tendon unit as well. But typically, early on, what we'll see is mostly neural, and then as time starts to go on, we'll see more and more muscle hypertrophy as well. Obviously, you can delve deeper and deeper as we go.
Yeah, what actually happens to the muscle to allow it to get bigger?
So obviously, the muscle adapts. All of our training is, we should always think of it as a stimulus. Like training doesn't do anything. It provides a stimulus to the body to adapt. So when we lift weights and when we're in there training, we will be providing a stimulus to our body to adapt. So hopefully you're all familiar with the concept of overload. So that's, we provide a workload that the body's not used to, and then the body will sense that and it will adapt to that. So if we're obviously challenging the muscles, so we may be asking the muscles to produce a lot of force, so producing a lot of called mechanical tension. We might be causing a lot of fatigue through the muscle. So when we contract our muscles, we'll be using force ATP, and then we'll be producing some metabolic byproducts. And we'll also potentially be causing muscle damage as well. And so they're the kind of 3 main ones, like muscle mechanical tension and activation, muscle metabolic aspects, and also muscle damage. So I'm getting a little golden retriever here who's interfering a bit. So they're the kind of stimulus we're giving to our body. And then what happens is through protein synthesis, we'll obviously increase the size of the muscle through there.
Earlier, when you talked about how you are recruiting muscle units and then over time you can start to create or recruit more, is that through just some more familiarity of lifting loads, or do you have to make changes in the program to like how you lift or the load itself to try and encourage the body to increase the recruitment of certain motor units?
Yeah, so on that kind of, we will think about it as like a level of activation firstly. So when we try to lift a weight as heavy as we possibly can, obviously we're sending a signal from the brain and from the spinal cord down to the muscle. So it's generally something called excitation, contraction, coupling, but it's basically we send an electrical signal down to the muscle. And we have lots of different muscle fibers, and it's called a motor unit. So a motor unit is the neuron and the muscle fibers. And these can be very small or very large. So they can go from a few muscle fibers right the way through to several thousand muscle fibers. And they've all got different kind of sizes. So the very, very small ones are normally activated first. And the reason for that is at really low force levels, we need to have good control. So if you're picking up your cup of tea or your beer, you want to have good control. So you're generally using the slightly smaller motor units. But when we're producing really heavy, producing lots of force or lifting heavy objects, we start to recruit progressively bigger motor units. And so we go from small motor units to the very large motor units. And if we're not used to lifting heavy weights, then we might not be recruiting these really large motor units because we need heavy forces to be able to do that. So what will happen is our body will learn to start to recruit these motor units a little bit earlier. And so it can basically reduce almost like the recruitment of these become a little bit easier. So as we send a signal down from the brain, we're able to recruit these muscle fibers slightly easier. So there's that kind of aspect, which is being able to recruit your main muscle, more of those muscle fibers. And then the other bit, of course, is that motor learning adaptation. So that is that before training, we're probably using our muscles in the wrong way. So maybe our antagonists are also potentially working as stabilizers. So we're lifting a weight, maybe we've not got the best balance and control. So we're having to recruit our antagonists as secondary stabilizers. And because antagonists will oppose your agonists, your main force producers, you won't be able to express your strength properly. So over time, we learn to use those muscles a little bit better. So you increase the activation of your stabilizers and your synergists. You reduce the activation of your antagonists. And that means that your main agonist muscles, so if it's an elbow curl, it'll be your biceps, they can produce more force. And so it's that kind of intramuscular coordination. We're able to use more of the motor units, and then we're able to control our muscles a little bit better with better coordination. And so they're the kind of two main types of neural adaptations we'll see.
When you're referring to teaching the body to recruit motor units that it's not used to, especially if it hasn't been strength trained before, I can imagine that happened quite quickly at first. So all the novice athletes that are not used to strength training increase strength quite quickly. And as we become stronger, that starts to slow down and plateau. What is it that stops us increasing strength at like such a linear rate? Why is it that we start to slow down? What makes it more difficult for the body to continue getting stronger?
Obviously, with that, as you said, like novice athletes probably can't recruit all of those muscle fibers effectively. So early on, what we'll see is a real improvement in coordination. So say you only had an activation capacity of 90% before, then very quickly you'll see maybe a 10% improvement in strength as you're able to access those muscle fibers a lot more. So that's basically just skill and learning, and that can happen within the same session sometimes. Or it generally happens very quickly, normally over 3 to 4 weeks. So some of the research that we did out of our lab and other labs show about a 20% increase in activation within 4 weeks of training. So really, really fast. And then if we're talking about like explosive force production, which I can talk about later, around rate of force development and the ability to produce to activate your muscles really, really quickly, you can see improvements in activation of around 50% within the first 4 weeks. But what happens is the window for improvement's obviously going to shorten and shorten. So once you're getting towards 100% activation of your muscle, you're able to already access those muscle fibers. So now what we need to see for improvements in strength is not the ability to recruit more muscle, but to increase the amount of muscle we have. So that's normally why we see this really quick increase, because we're able to express the muscle that we have a lot better. But then the plateau it becomes difficult to then obviously hypertrophy those muscle fibers. And so we'll typically see a very quick increase in strength, normally within the first 4 to 5 weeks, and then a very slow linear increase over time as we hypertrophy as well.
Yeah. If using powerlifting as an example, like powerlifters train at their craft for like years and years. It seems to be slightly later on when they reach their peak. It's not like football and rugby where it seems to be in their 20s. It seems to be much later, like in their 30s. So that development of strength is a very long process. So if they're training well, that development of strength should increase over time each year. Once you get to that top end of strength, what is it that separates those that get really strong versus those that just get strong? What is it that's sending people to that next level to be really, really good powerlifters? I mean, one of them must be the technique. You're talking about the intermuscular coordination. Yep. I mean, they're constantly learning their craft. It might seem quite simple just to be doing deadlifting and squatting, but they are technically quite complex skills. So that's clearly one. But is there anything, I'm trying to think of like the muscle physiology of someone that's just so strong, kind of like what does it look like?
Yeah, so obviously bits of it will be, as you said, the neural side of it, so ability to recruit more muscle fibers. A lot of the research around neuromuscular activation is really simplistic. So a lot of the time it's done in quite controlled lab-based studies, very simple tasks. But the more complex the task, the more skill that's required. And a lot of our kind of phys and strength-based research is done in really simple tasks. And so although we think the nervous system's important, we probably undervalue its importance, because the more complex that task becomes, the more the nervous system will contribute to differences between people. So, and so when we start to think more about, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, they're quite difficult skills, and they will take a long time to master and to really express the muscle quality, the muscle coordination. So there's that learning effect over time. And then, of course, you will certainly have a genetic element in terms of your ability to hypertrophy those muscles. So everyone has typically a limit on the number of muscle fibers that you have. And the main way of increasing the muscle size is through increasing the size of your existing muscle fibers rather than increasing the number of muscle fibers. So we hypertrophy our existing fibers, and the concept of hyperplasia, which is an increase in the number of fibers, isn't really strong evidence. You might see a small increase, but most people are born with a genetic limit on how many muscle fibers they have. And there's a ceiling on how big these muscle fibers can become. And once we hit that ceiling, then you're not going to hypertrophy that muscle anymore. So everyone has this just genetic ceiling. And I think over time, it's going to take a number of years to get towards that. And then those people potentially genetically more gifted and are going to then continue to see those improvements as well.
Going through my head, I'm thinking like, okay, what recommendations can I give for those that are trying to search for their genetic ceiling, their ceiling that they've got? And based on what you're saying regarding developing muscle size through hypertrophy, would you recommend, or it's very understandable that, say, lifters or powerlifters sometimes go through like a loading base where their aim is more hypertrophy and muscle size, and then that leads into a more strength-based sort of mesocycle. So they're going from muscle size to where they might be lifting an increased number of reps and sets, but with moderate loads around 70%, and then they reduce the amount of volume but increase the intensity, and that intensity goes up nearer towards their 1RM. Does that kind of make sense from like a muscle physiology point of view? Build that base through building the size and then increase the load to try and increase the neuromuscular adaptations to reach higher levels of strength?
Yeah, completely. Yes. As long as you've got the time to do that, and obviously most powerlifters, their main focus is improving in powerlifting. So if you're a team sport athlete, you might not have the luxury of that kind of periodized model. But if you're going to get better at powerlifting, then these kind of conventional periodized models of work capacity and then hypertrophy, the maximal strength and an increase in specificity over time is really important. And it makes sense on a muscle phys basis because, one, you're going to, from a strength mesocycle strength program, you're going to get more benefits if you've got more muscle to recruit. So yes, strength training will have these neural adaptations, but if you've got quite a small, available muscle size, you're going to maximize that pretty early. But so by going through a hypertrophy phase, you're going to increase the amount of size, but you're probably not going to improve your activation that much, in that most of your improvement in strength is going to be through an increase in muscle size. And then when you switch to a strength phase, you've now got a good window for improving strength also through neural adaptations. You've got like a bigger window for training. There's also good evidence that if you follow that pattern, that it leads to better improvements. So some of the periodization literature shows that through going through those sequences of hypertrophy through to maximal strength, over the course of the whole program, you get better adaptations. So on a muscle phys level, it makes sense, and the research backs it up as well for improving strength over a long period of time.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of different windows of opportunity. One of the most popular powerlifting programs that has been in the last 40 years seems to be the West Side Barbell program, where they seem to have a max day and a dynamic day. And so on their dynamic day, they're lifting around 50 to 60%, but the aim is, the reps are low, but they're looking to move that as quickly as possible. So they're introducing higher speed movements to try and improve their strength. What kind of adaptations occur when you shift your focus in training towards moving a load as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so obviously, the focus there will be a different type of strength, and we do have different types of strength, and that's one of the important bits early on. Is people sometimes think that strength is just the maximum amount of weight you can lift or the most force you can produce, but strength does depend on the context. So the context being that if you was to measure someone in a very isolated situation, which is what we do in the lab, you strap them up on a dynamometer, you use seat belts and you fixate them in a particular position. That's a very isolated situation. Now, that means that we're not asking those people to have a lot of skill in that situation. But then we also have much more functional situations where we're asking them to lift a barbell, we're asking them to do a squat or a deadlift. It's a bit more dynamic than these controlled situations. So we do have this isolated and functional strength, but we also have an ability to produce force at different speeds. So that's strength at slow velocities, slow speeds, or strength at higher speeds. So something called the force velocity curve or the torque velocity curve is one way of thinking about that you can be strong at one speed and a little bit weaker at a different speed. So through training, maybe at different loads and different intentions, so lifting a lighter weight a lot heavier, you're going to see an improvement in strength at higher velocities. And there's also different strength in terms of how much time you have to produce the force. So we've got something called maximal strength, which is the most weight you can lift or the highest amount of force you can produce. There's also something called rate of force development. So that's how quickly you can increase your force from low to high levels. That becomes really important for explosive tasks. So whether that's Olympic lifting, whether that's sprinting or sports performance, like changing direction. So we do have different contexts. So that's time and how complex the movement is. So when you start to do heavy load lifting, you're going to see a stimulus for increasing things like maximal activation and increasing hypertrophy. But when you're training at lower loads and at higher velocities, you're going to see a better improvement in high velocity strength, but also your ability to recruit those muscle fibers quicker as well. So that is a different type of activation. It's not your maximal activation, it's how fast you can increase the number of motor units that are active. And so that's really important when thinking about planning. What adaptation are you chasing? Are you just chasing really, really high force? Are you chasing explosive force or high velocity strength? And what mechanism do you want to chase it through? Do you want to target the neural adaptations, or are you going after hypertrophy? And I always like to think of the mechanism that I want to get first, and then you plan off that. So if you're trying to get neural activation, you either do high loads or you do explosive tasks. If you want hypertrophy, volume and the number of reps becomes pretty important as well.
Does changing between these types of training then shifts the focus on different types of muscle fibers? So there's the type 2A, type 2B, all of the different types of muscle fibers.
Yep.
Does changing the load then influence the type of fibers that you are recruiting through training?
It will, and obviously the context of thinking about how to recruit these fibers is something called the size principle. It's called Henneman's size principle. And basically, normally your biggest motor units, the really, really fast explosive ones, are the hardest ones to recruit. And the smaller motor units were recruited a lot easier. They're normally your type 1 muscle fibers, and they're used over longer periods of time and sustained contractions. So really heavy loads are going to recruit more motor units, and they're normally your type 2 fibers that are going to get recruited. So sometimes we need really heavy loads to recruit that, but there are other ways of recruiting these high threshold motor units And that is also for explosive strength training. So lifting a lighter weight much more explosively, we can recruit these motor units a lot earlier and a lot faster. So if you want to get some kind of hypertrophy, sometimes going for explosive strength training is a good way. And explosive strength training, you will see improvements in things like muscle tendon stiffness, and you'll see improvements in the contractile properties. So that is like how well the muscle responds to activation. Particularly those type 2 muscle fibers will respond better to heavy loads or to explosive contractions. And also on a programming level, it's hard to sustain really heavy loads day in, day out. So of course you need to mix the training type throughout the week. You can't just lift continuous heavy loads because your body will just adapt to that training. So sometimes mixing your training goal throughout the day gives you different adaptations, but it also allows your body to receive different inputs, but to get a little bit of recovery from these sustained lifts. So you don't just want to lift heavy every single day. There are benefits both on a recovery level, but also on a different adaptation level to lifting differently as well.
Yeah. It sounds so beneficial to really focus on every rep, because in a session, say you're warming up to a particular max, or you're including loads that are slightly lower because you want to work on them at a faster rate. So they are like your speed reps.
Yep.
It seems so essential because incorporating that work into your strength work will enable the body to not only recruit things faster, but recruit certain fibers that are more difficult to recruit. So when you've got a heavy load and you need all the fibers to help you out, having a bolus of training which focuses on light, more speed stuff seems to make sense, because that trainers helps the strength training recruit everything that's going to help you get stronger. That's kind of what's going through my head at the moment.
Yeah, completely. And yeah, different ways of going about it, of course, is just said that it makes sense on multiple levels. One, to target that through a different mechanism, but your body, it does need a little bit of time to recover, because we get stronger in our recovery, not necessarily in the gym. It's those recovery periods that we need. And whenever we're training, we should be thinking about the mechanism we're driving. So do we want the muscle to get bigger? Do we want it to get an improvement in activation? And so yeah, challenging those different methods is really key as well.
How do these two different types of training, like heavy training and then faster training, also change the properties of the tendon? Because you've mentioned the tendon a few times, and obviously the tendon is attached to the muscle and the bone that's creating the movement. So when you see adaptations to the muscle, you'd assume that adaptations happen to the tendon as well to transfer that force better. What kind of things happen there?
Yes, so obviously you'll see changes in the tendon. So as you said, like we contract a muscle only works through its interactions with tendon. So the muscle contracts, it obviously generally shortens, and it will pull on the tendon, and then the tendon will pull on the bone to cause movement. And generally what we see is something called an increase in muscle tendon stiffness. So that is there's the stiffness of the tendon, it won't stretch as much. And that will vary slightly with heavy resistance training, particularly with the intensity of training. So tendon stiffness adapts to really, really high loads or explosive contractions. But generally lower loads are not so good at eliciting it. So if you're working at kind of like a 70% max strength, or a 12, 14 RM, you're not going to get those tendon adaptations as much. You either need really, really high loads, or you need really explosive contractions. And so your conventional hypertrophy training is not going to drive these tendon adaptations as much, whereas your very, very heavy loads or your explosive stuff will. And the benefit there is that when you want to produce force really quickly, there's something called an electromechanical delay, basically. But so you contract the muscle starts to stretch the tendon, but the tendon might have a little bit tendon needs to first be stretched before it can move the bone. So that bit of tendon slack needs to be taken up. So the stiffer the tendon, the less tendon slack. And so when we want to produce force really, really quickly, a stiffer tendon means that when we start to produce force in the muscle, we get movement a lot faster. And that becomes particularly important for your Olympic lifts, where you need to produce force really quickly. So driving those adaptations, you either need really, really high forces or explosive contractions. Your conventional kind of hypertrophy stuff isn't normally sufficient.
What kind of changes happen to the tendon on a micro level? So what I mean by, I know that predominantly tendon is made up of collagen fibers.
Yeah.
By applying regular load through it, does that change the organization of those collagen fibers to help with the transmission of force?
Yes. So we'll drive. We don't know as much about tendon adaptations as we do through the muscle, but yeah, you will see a reorganization of those tendon fibers, and generally a transition in the collagen fiber types as well. So kind of a shift from towards kind of type 3 collagen fibers, where we'll generally see like a strengthening of the organization of that tendon, much the same we see a change in the muscle. But with muscle, we don't really see a change in the type of muscle. So like at a muscle level, you have like your actin, your myosin molecules, and you don't really see a big change in the organization of that, like you do with tendon. With muscle, you generally see an increase in the number of muscle fibers, or you are able to activate more of those muscle fibers. But with tendon, you normally see a reorganization of the type of collagen fibers.
And finally, what would be great to sort of touch on is you've highlighted that people have like a genetic ceiling. So what is it about genetics that will help? Well, let's say you've got like an elite athlete. They are one of the best of the best. What kind of things separate them from a sub-elite athlete from a strength perspective? And some of this might be stuff you've already touched on, but what is their ability that enables them to get to that level? Why do they have a ceiling that's much higher than the average person?
Yep. So obviously, genetics-wise, you'll have, everyone has a different genetic profile, of course, and there are certain genotypes that are more suited towards power and strength, and there are, of course, more suited towards endurance athletes. And so you can kind of see that on the spectrum of endurance and strength and power genes. And normally, your mix of those different genes will predominate whether you're better in one sport or in another. And we typically normally select ourselves out of sports that we're not genetically designed for. So an endurance runner is never going to be an Olympic powerlifter, much the same as an Olympic powerlifter is typically never going to be a great endurance athlete. So, and that's because our body will adapt to different types of training. So if you've got the correct makeup of, say, endurance genes, then you're going to adapt to endurance training, and you can see a lot of endurance adaptations in the same way you will with strength and power training. And on a strength and power level, it will be made up of things such as the number of muscle fibers that you have. And so everyone has this genetic ceiling on the number of fibers. If we want to produce force expression is really based on how many muscle fibers we have. So the more muscle fibers we have, typically the more force we can produce, as long as we can activate all of those fibers. And in terms of that, your ability to hypertrophy to resistance training is going to differ across different people. So if we each do the same relative workload, some people will hypertrophy a lot easier. And that hypertrophy will be based on your kind of nuclei within the muscle cell, and particularly something called the satellite cells. The satellite cells are these little kind of dormant cells that exist outside the muscle fibers. And when we damage a fiber or we need to hypertrophy, these satellite cells will proliferate into the muscle, and they will help hypertrophy that muscle. And every muscle has a particular ceiling based on the number of nuclei there is. So there's a certain space. A nuclei can only control a certain amount of the muscle. And so depending on how many of these we have dictates the size of the muscle that we can have. And the number of satellite cells that we have will dictate how fast and easily we can hypertrophy to training. So it's kind of a mix between the satellite cells and the genomes that we have, and that will dictate how we adapt to training. And essentially, we only get stronger because of adaptations. So training is a stimulus. We have to adapt to that training stimulus. That's how we get stronger. That's how we get more powerful. It's not the training, it's the adaptations that happen in recovery. And so everyone will have a genetic limit on muscle size, and everyone has a different adaptation to training. And it's really driving those better adaptations. And we do have genetic limits, but of course, there are a lot of environmental factors like nutrition and sleep and quality of life and all these other things that aid us in, of course, getting better adaptations as well.
And based on everything that we've discussed, more from like a muscle physiology point of view, if anyone's listening to this and they want to get more strong and they want to get more powerful, what kind of recommendations would you give, maybe from like a programming level, to maximize those adaptations? Like you said, it's the adaptations that make you stronger, not always the training. So we need to maximize the training to ensure that the adaptations are correct to head us in the right direction. So yeah, like it's like a summary. What would be your recommendation to anyone listening?
Yeah, so first, I think training history really is important. So whenever you want to design a program, you first got to do what's called your needs analysis. You've got to know what's your training goal. So what's your aim? Is it if it's getting stronger and more powerful, then you set that as your training goal. You then need to do a kind of almost like a profile. It doesn't need to be really sophisticated, but it could be that if you've not trained for if you haven't been training for a number of years and you're quite a novice, then you're going to need a different training program to a more advanced athlete. So we need to know how many years have you been training, what's your training experience. And then also based on, what's your kind of profile that you have. So this is good if you can do testing, but if you can't, it's, what's your body fat composition? What's your, how big are you at the moment? So if you're reasonably slender, then driving hypertrophy might be your best goal. But if you've already got a good muscle size, then driving strength more through kind of neural adaptations is more appropriate. And so you need to think about what's your main training goal. So if you need to have a hypertrophy block because you need to increase your muscle size, then you should design your training program around that priority. But if you've already got a really good muscle size base, then you can almost skip that bit and you can challenge strength through skill and coordination. So make sure you're using your compound lifts rather than a lot of accessory movements. And also, of course, challenging it through the right reps and sets and volume. So if you want to challenge strength through muscle size, then you need to be using things like you need to be having high volume. And the evidence that for muscle size, muscle hypertrophy is not that strong, that you can get it through different methods. You don't just have to do an 8RM to drive hypertrophy. You can do heavier lifts as long as you've got sufficient volume. It's more about the volume for hypertrophy. You need to do enough lifts. But you can get it on an 8RM or a 12RM or a 15RM or a 3RM. And so it's making sure that you're picking the right reps and the right volume to get the right adaptation. So if you want hypertrophy, make sure you're getting enough volume. Make sure you're getting enough protein and enough sleep, and you're taking care of yourself after the sessions in your recovery. But if you've already got a really good muscle size and you're pretty happy that way, just make sure that you're lifting heavy and you're lifting technically proficiently as well. So if you haven't got a good, if you're big and reasonably strong, but you've not had a good exposure to lifting, you'll see a lot of improvements in strength just through practicing those techniques as well. So I think the first bit is just know yourself, know what goals you have, and then start to think, do you want to get bigger, or is it getting stronger and more skilled? And then just targeting the right training according to that, if that answers that, Phil.
No, that's brilliant. It's allowed me to reflect a lot on my training. I'm starting to think, okay, in the past when I've known that I've needed to train to increase my muscle size, what training have I responded best to? And you see it in like the magazines all the time. It's like, if you're working on hypertrophy, stick to like 8 to 10 reps and all that sort of thing to increase time under tension. And while they're good variables to be aware of, the best programs that I've always used have been the ones where the reps are between 3 and 5. And so because the reps are lower, the loads have been heavier, but the rest periods have been pretty low. And I've done like double the amount of sets. And that may be just because that's the way I'm built to adapt. That seems to be the best way to stimulate growth with me. But I've seen a lot of people utilize the same methods and have similar success. So it seems to be that, maybe we don't need to think about the whole 8 to 12, bit like what you're saying, how, you could go to the threes and still find the ability to adapt to that and increase muscle size, because there are other variables you can alter to still get either same or even better response.
Yeah, exactly. And as you pointed there, like the rest periods are really key when you're training as well. And a lot of people neglect sometimes the rest periods. So they'll say, okay, I'm going to go in and I'm going to lift this weight. I'm going to do, 8 times 6 or whatever. But if you don't specify the rest period, you'll get completely different adaptations. So the rest period is what drives that adaptation. So if you've got really, really short rest period and you're still lifting pretty heavy, you're not going to get full recovery. So you're then going to get this metabolic fatigue. And you can get that metabolic fatigue whether you're doing loads of reps or you're doing short number of reps, but it's how much rest period you have. And so, if you lift heavy, reasonably short rest periods, you're still going to get this metabolic fatigue, but you're also going to get a lot of mechanical tension. So you can drive hypertrophy through mechanical tension, really, really heavy loads, really high activation. You can drive it through metabolic fatigue, or you can drive it through muscle damage. You've got different ways of doing it. You don't just have to do 8 to 12 reps with this 1 to 2 minutes rest period. There are different ways you can do it. And I think that's why a lot of the research isn't always that clear. It's because there's different ways to get to the same end product.
Yeah, definitely. Matt, that was absolutely brilliant. If anyone has any further questions, where on social media could they fire you a question if they do have one?
Cool. So I have Twitter account, /Buckthorpe is the handle, and also happy reach out on LinkedIn. Again, just search for the name Matthew Buckthorpe, it should come up. Don't currentently have an Instagram, but happy also if people want to reach out via my email, which is mbuckthorpe@hotmail.com as well. More of a personal one rather than won't give out my work email. But yeah, happy to via email or again social media. Equally happy as well. Just send a message, and always happy to answer any questions.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I'll put all of that in the show notes. And once again, thank you so much for coming on to Progress Theory.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Phil. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.